The storm was already tearing through the bayou when Jonah Wells broke his chains with a stolen blacksmith's hammer. Rain lashed his face like bullets as he staggered into the screaming wind, blood streaming from his wrists where the iron had bitten deep. Behind him, the overseer's dogs howled from inside their flooded kennel, and somewhere in the darkness, a massive oak crashed to the earth with a sound like thunder. Jonah didn't look back. 40 miles away on another plantation swallowed by the same merciless storm, his wife Lila waited, not knowing if this night would be her last. The hurricane of 1837 was the deadliest the Gulf had ever seen. But for Jonah, it wasn't an obstacle. It was his only chance. What the witnesses would later swear they saw, what the survivors would whisper about in the years to come, was something that defied all reason. They said the storm moved with him, that it bent to his will, that nature itself conspired to reunite two souls that no law or master could keep apart. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The day had started with deceptive calm, the kind of stillness that settles over Louisiana in late September when the air hangs thick and heavy like wet wool. Jonah Wells had been working the sugarcane fields of the Beaumont plantation since before dawn, his back bent under the relentless sun, his hands wrapped around the wooden handle of his cutting blade. He was 32 years old, though the years of bondage had carved lines into his face that made him look older. His shoulders were broad from labor and his arms roped with muscle that came from endless days of work that would break lesser men. But it wasn't his physical strength that defined Jonah Wells. It was the fire that burned behind his dark eyes, a determination that no amount of cruelty had been able to extinguish. He had been separated from Lila for 6 months, sold away from the riverside plantation where they had been married in secret by an old preacher who moved between the quarters after dark. The marriage wasn't legal, not in the eyes of the law that saw them as property rather than people, but it was real in the only way that mattered. They had spoken their vows under a crescent moon with nothing but the stars as witnesses and the sound of the river as their music. Jonah could still remember the way Lila's hand had trembled in his, the way her voice had caught when she promised to love him until her last breath. He had made the same promise, and he intended to keep it, no matter what stood in his way. The master of Beaumont Plantation, a heavy-set man named Richard Beaumont, had purchased Jonah for his strength and his skill with the cane. What Beaumont didn't know was that Jonah had spent every single day since his arrival planning his escape. He had studied the land, memorized the paths through the swamps, learned which bayous were navigable and which would swallow a man whole. He had listened to the other enslaved workers talk about the layout of neighboring plantations, filing away every detail, every scrap of information that might help him find his way back to Lila. He had stolen scraps of food and hidden them in a hollowed-out section of the quarter's wall, preparing for the day when he would run. He knew the risks. He knew that if he was caught, the punishment would be brutal, possibly fatal. But the thought of Lila alone, perhaps suffering, perhaps believing he had forgotten her, was worse than any punishment the masters could devise. The storm had announced itself around noon with a shift in the wind that made the oldest workers look up from their labor with worried expressions. The sky had turned a sickly yellow-green color, and the air pressure had dropped until it felt like the world was holding its breath. By 2 in the afternoon, the first raindrops had started to fall, fat and warm, spattering against the leaves of the cane with a sound like distant applause. The overseer, a thin man with a perpetual sneer named Garrett, had shouted for everyone to keep working, but even he couldn't hide the nervousness in his voice. This wasn't an ordinary storm. Everyone could feel it. By 4, the rain was falling in sheets, and the wind had picked up enough to bend the sugarcane stalks nearly horizontal. The masters had retreated to the big house, their white columns gleaming wetly in the strange half-light, while the enslaved workers were herded into the quarters. A long, low building with a leaking roof and walls that shook with every gust. Jonah had been chained to a support beam, punishment for what Garrett called insolence. But what had really been Jonah asking for water after 8 hours in the field? The chain was old but strong, attached to an iron cuff around his left wrist. Garrett had smiled as he locked it, his yellow teeth showing through thin lips. He had promised to return in the morning to continue the lesson. But Garrett hadn't counted on the storm. None of them had. As the afternoon wore into evening, the hurricane hit with a force that seemed biblical in its fury. The wind rose to a howl that drowned out all other sound, a constant scream that made the quarters shake and groan. Rain pounded against the roof with the force of gravel thrown by giant hands, and through the gaps in the walls, Jonah could see palm trees bent double, their fronds streaming like flags. The support beam he was chained to creaked ominously with every gust. Water began to seep up through the floorboards as the bayou overflowed its banks, cold and dark and carrying the smell of mud and decay. The other people in the quarters huddled together in the center of the room, as far from the walls as they could get. Old Marcus, who claimed to be 70, though no one knew for sure, was leading them in prayer, his voice barely audible over the storm. Children cried and were shushed by their mothers. A young woman named Clara clutched a baby to her chest, her eyes wide with terror. Jonah watched them all and felt his resolve harden like iron cooling in water. If he was going to run, it had to be now. The storm was chaos, yes, but it was also opportunity. The masters would be sheltering in place. The dogs would be useless in this weather. The swamps would be treacherous, but no more treacherous than they usually were, and the rain would wash away his scent. Most importantly, Lila was 40 miles east on the riverside plantation, and if this storm was as big as it seemed, she was in danger. He had to reach her. The decision made, Jonah began to work on his chain. The support beam was solid, sunk deep into the foundation, but the iron loop that held his chain was bolted into the wood, and wood could rot. He had noticed earlier that the area around the bolt was soft, the wood darkened with water damage and age. Using his free hand, he began to dig at the wood with his fingernails, tearing away chunks of the rotted material. It was slow, painful work. His nails broke and bled, but he kept at it, working with a desperate intensity while the storm raged around him. An hour passed, maybe more. Time had lost its meaning in the chaos. Finally, he felt the bolt shift slightly in its housing. He wrapped the chain around his hand for leverage and pulled with all his strength. The wood groaned, held, then gave way with a crack that was lost in the thunder. The bolt came free, and suddenly Jonah was loose, still wearing the cuff and trailing a length of chain, but no longer tethered. He stood, his legs stiff from sitting, and looked around the quarters. Old Marcus had stopped praying and was staring at him with an expression that mixed hope and fear. Clara looked away, pressing her baby's face against her shoulder. They all knew what running meant. They all knew the consequences if he was caught or if they were seen helping him. Jonah met Marcus's eyes and gave a single nod. The old man nodded back, a gesture that said more than words ever could. Then Jonah turned to the door, braced himself, and stepped out into the storm. The wind hit him like a physical blow, nearly knocking him off his feet. Rain pelted his face so hard it stung, and within seconds he was soaked to the skin. The world was a chaos of water and wind and flying debris. A piece of roof tile shot past his head and embedded itself in a tree trunk. Branches whipped through the air like angry spirits. The ground beneath his feet was already ankle-deep in water, and he could feel the current tugging at his legs. Jonah oriented himself, remembering the maps he had built in his mind over months of careful observation. East. He needed to go east, toward the sunrise, toward the river, toward Lila. He lowered his head against the wind and started walking. The first mile was a nightmare of stumbling progress through wind that threatened to tear him from his feet with every step. He used trees as anchors, grabbing trunks and pulling himself forward from one to the next. The chain attached to his wrist kept catching on branches and roots, and twice he had to stop and work it free, his hands shaking with cold and urgency. Lightning split the sky with increasing frequency, turning the night into a strobing nightmare of harsh white light and absolute darkness. In one flash, he saw a barn collapse in the distance, its walls folding inward like paper. In another, he glimpsed the swollen bayou, its waters churning with debris, tree trunks, pieces of buildings, things he couldn't identify. After what might have been an hour, he reached the edge of Beaumont land and entered the stretch of swamp and forest that separated the plantation from its neighbors. This was territory he had studied but never crossed. Land that was wild and dangerous even in good weather. Now, in the grip of the hurricane, it was a hellscape. The water was waist-deep in places, and the current was strong enough that he had to fight to keep his feet. He waded through stands of cypress, their knees jutting up from the water like the bones of buried giants. Spanish moss, torn loose by the wind, flew through the air in gray streamers. Something large splashed nearby, and Jonah couldn't tell if it was a falling branch or an alligator displaced by the rising water. He kept moving east, always east, using the lightning to navigate. Each flash gave him a snapshot of the world around him, a frozen moment that he had to process and use before darkness returned. Tree line that way, open water this way, high ground ahead. He moved on instinct and determination, his body operating on a level beyond conscious thought. His wrists ached where the iron cuff had rubbed them raw. His legs burned with effort. His lungs felt like they were full of water. But the thought of Lila kept him going. She would be frightened, and she might be in danger. The old slave quarters at Riverside were even worse than the ones at Beaumont. Little more than shacks that would provide no protection against a storm like this. He had to reach her. The storm seemed to grow stronger as he pushed forward. The wind howled with voices that sounded almost human, and the rain fell so thick it was like trying to breathe underwater. Trees bent and broke around him. A massive live oak, the kind that had stood for centuries, crashed down so close that he felt the impact through the ground and the spray of debris peppered his back. But as terrifying as it was, Jonah began to notice something strange. The storm seemed to be moving with him. When he changed direction, the wind changed with him. When he paused to rest for a moment, the intensity lessened slightly. When he pushed forward again, the hurricane surged as if urging him onward. It was impossible, irrational, but he could feel it in his bones. The storm was no longer just weather. It was something more, something that recognized his purpose and either agreed with it or was bound to it in a way he couldn't understand. By the time he crossed into the territory of the next plantation, a smaller holding called Greenwood, the water was chest-deep in the low areas. He could no longer walk. He had to swim, fighting the current that wanted to sweep him away into the darkness. The chain on his wrist became a deadly weight, dragging him down. He had to use both hands to swim, kicking furiously, gasping for air between waves. Debris slammed into him. Branches and boards and things he couldn't identify in the dark. Something sharp gouged his leg, sending a bolt of pain up his thigh, but he couldn't stop to examine the wound. He could feel blood mixing with the water, warm against his skin. But he forced himself to keep moving. Sometime deep in the night, he passed through what remained of Greenwood Plantation itself. The big house was dark, its windows boarded, and even through the storm he could hear the sound of wood tearing and glass breaking as the hurricane tested its defenses. He gave it wide berth, staying in the tree line, moving like a ghost through water that now came to his shoulders. He saw no one, Everyone with sense was sheltering inside, praying that the walls would hold. A part of Jonah felt a grim satisfaction at that. Let them be afraid. Let them feel helpless for once. Let them know what it was like to be at the mercy of forces beyond their control. The miles passed in a blur of exhaustion and determination. His sense of time had completely dissolved. He didn't know if he had been traveling for hours or days. All he knew was the next tree, the next rise of ground, the next stretch of water to cross. His body was a mass of cuts and bruises. The wound in his leg throbbed with every movement. His hands were so cold he could barely feel them, but he kept the image of Lila fixed in his mind like a guiding star. Her smile, rare and precious. The sound of her voice when she sang quietly while working. The way her hand fit perfectly in his. The promise he had made to always find her no matter what. Dawn came slowly. A gradual lightening of the sky from black to gray to a sickly yellow. The storm hadn't lessened. If anything, it had grown stronger. The wind was a constant scream now, and the rain fell so hard it was difficult to see more than a few feet in any direction. But the light, weak as it was, helped Jonah orient himself. He had crossed 2 more plantations during the night, staying away from the big houses, following the bayous and waterways that connected the properties. According to his calculations, based on distances he had memorized from overheard conversations and stolen glances at maps, he was close to Riverside now. Maybe 5 miles, maybe less. The thought gave him new strength. He pushed harder, ignoring his body's screaming protests. It was mid-morning when he finally saw the first boundary marker of Riverside Plantation. A stone post carved with initials that were now almost worn smooth. Jonah felt something unlock in his chest, a tension he hadn't even realized he was carrying. He was close. So close. The slave quarters were on the south side of the property, near the fields, a collection of rough cabins that housed nearly 80 people. Lila would be there unless the storm had forced everyone into one of the sturdier buildings. He had to find her. He had to make sure she was safe. But as he entered Riverside land, Jonah became aware that the storm had changed again. The wind was no longer pushing him forward. Instead, it seemed to be circling, gathering strength as if preparing for something. The eye, he realized. They were approaching the eye of the hurricane. He had heard old sailors talk about it. The calm center of the storm where the wind died and the sun sometimes broke through. But the eye was also a trap because after it passed, the backside of the hurricane would hit with even more violence than the front. He had to find Lila and get them both to safety before that happened. The approach to the slave quarters took him through flooded fields where the sugarcane had been beaten flat, the stalks lying in twisted piles like the bodies on a battlefield. The water was deeper here, fed by runoff from higher ground, and strong enough that he had to angle his path to avoid being swept away. Buildings emerged from the rain like ghosts, their shapes unclear until he was almost upon them. A storage shed, its door hanging loose, a smokehouse, its chimney broken, and then, finally, the quarters themselves. They were in bad shape. One of the cabins had lost its roof entirely, and another had partially collapsed, its walls caved in by a fallen tree. The others stood but looked like they might give way at any moment. People huddled in doorways, staring out at the storm with expressions of numb horror. Children clung to their mothers. Men stood with axes and hammers, ready to fight the storm if it came to that, though everyone knew weapons were useless against wind and water. Jonah moved through the chaos, searching face after face, his heart pounding so hard it hurt. Where was she? Which cabin? Then he saw her, and his heart nearly stopped. Lila was helping an elderly woman move belongings from a flooding cabin to higher ground, her dress soaked and clinging to her frame, her hair plastered to her head by rain. She looked thinner than he remembered, and there was a bruise on her cheek that made his hands curl into fists. But she was alive. She was moving, helping others, being the strong, caring person he had fallen in love with. Jonah called her name, but the wind tore the word from his mouth. He pushed forward, stumbling through the water, and called again, louder this time. Lila turned, and for a moment she just stared, her eyes wide with disbelief. Then recognition hit, and the bundle she was carrying fell from her hands into the water. She took a step toward him, then another, then she was running, splashing through the flood, her face transformed by joy and terror and desperate hope. They crashed together in the middle of the flooded yard, and Jonah wrapped his arms around her so tightly he was afraid he might hurt her. But he couldn't let go. Lila was sobbing against his chest, her whole body shaking, and he realized he was crying too, tears mixing with rain on his face. They held each other while the hurricane raged around them, while the world tried to tear itself apart, and for a moment nothing else existed. But the moment couldn't last. Lila pulled back, looking up at him with eyes full of questions. "How did you get here? Why did you come? What about the masters?" But before he could answer, a shout cut through the storm. Jonah turned to see 3 white men emerging from the direction of the big house, all wearing oilskin coats and carrying rifles. He recognized the one in front, the oldest of the 3 Riverside sons, a man named Jameson who had a reputation for cruelty that made even hardened overseers uneasy. Behind him were his brothers, Garrett and Wesley, both younger but cut from the same cloth. Jameson was shouting something, but the wind made it impossible to hear the words. He didn't need to hear them. The meaning was clear from the way the rifles were being raised, from the fury on their faces. A runaway on the property. A runaway during a storm when control was already slipping. A runaway embracing his wife when he should be in chains. Jonah felt Lila stiffen in his arms, felt her start to pull away, but he held her close. He had not crossed 40 miles of hurricane-ravaged wilderness to give her up now. He had not survived drowning and debris and exhaustion to let these men take her back. The storm seemed to sense his resolve. The wind, which had been dying as they approached the eye, suddenly surged again with renewed fury. What happened next was something that would be talked about in whispers for generations. A story that would be dismissed by some as impossible and remembered by others as proof that God or fate or something beyond understanding sometimes takes a hand in human affairs. As Jameson and his brothers waded forward, raising their rifles against the wind, the storm hit the Riverside big house with the full force of its fury. The sound was like a cannon blast, a tremendous crack that somehow carried over the roar of wind and rain. Everyone turned to look, and what they saw made even hardened souls go pale. The entire east wing of the mansion was collapsing. The walls folded inward, and the roof came down in a cascade of tiles and timber. Windows exploded outward in sprays of glass that glittered in the strange light. A massive oak tree, torn from the ground, roots and all, fell directly onto the main structure, its trunk punching through the upper floor like a spear through paper. Jameson froze, his face going white. Behind him, Garrett and Wesley were already turning, running back toward the house, shouting about their parents, about the servants, about everything they were about to lose. Jameson held his ground for one moment longer, his rifle still pointed in Jonah's direction, his finger on the trigger. Their eyes met across the flooded yard, and Jonah saw the calculation happening behind those cold blue eyes. Shoot the runaway or save the family? Maintain control or survive? For a heartbeat, it could have gone either way. Then another section of the house collapsed with a roar that sounded like the earth opening up, and Jameson broke. He turned and ran, splashing through the water, the rifle forgotten at his side. Jonah didn't wait to see what would happen. He grabbed Lila's hand and pulled her toward the tree line on the north side of the property. Behind them, people were shouting, some running toward the collapsing mansion to help, others running away from it to safety. The world was chaos. The storm was everywhere at once, tearing and destroying, reshaping the landscape with casual violence. A chunk of roof the size of a wagon flew past, tumbling through the air before crashing into a grove of pecan trees. The water was rising fast now, fed by the storm surge and the swollen river, already waist-deep in places that had been barely wet an hour before. They ran, or tried to, but running in water that deep was nearly impossible. It was more like fighting, pushing against resistance with every step, while the wind tried to knock them down and the rain tried to blind them. Jonah kept Lila's hand locked in his, terrified that if he let go for even a second, the storm would tear her away. Behind them, he could hear the mansion continuing to break apart, each collapse punctuated by screams and shouts. Part of him felt a savage satisfaction at that. Let them feel what it was like to lose everything. Let them know terror and helplessness. But most of him was focused only on survival, on getting Lila away from this place, on finding safety before the full fury of the storm's backside arrived. They reached the tree line and plunged into the forest beyond. The trees provided some shelter from the wind, but they were also hazards, constantly shedding branches and sometimes falling entirely. Jonah led them north and west, away from the plantation, away from the big house and the quarters and everything they had known. He had no plan beyond getting distance and finding high ground. The forest was flooding, water rising between the trees, but it wasn't as deep here as in the open fields. They could move faster, though every step was treacherous with hidden roots and holes. Lila was keeping pace, her hand tight in his, but he could feel her tiring. She had been through her own ordeal, whatever had happened in the 6 months since they had been separated, and it showed in the way she moved, in the bruises on her skin, in the hollow look around her eyes. They needed to find shelter, somewhere they could rest and wait out the storm. But where? Every building for miles would be destroyed or barely standing. The only option was to find natural shelter, a cave or an overhang or something that could protect them from the worst of the wind and rain. They climbed, following the gradual rise of the land, heading for the low hills that marked the beginning of the piney woods. The going got harder as the ground rose, but the water got shallower, finally dropping to ankle depth and then disappearing entirely. The rain was still falling in sheets and the wind was still trying to tear the trees from the ground. But being out of the flood gave them new hope. Jonah remembered hearing about limestone caves in these hills, places where runaway slaves sometimes hid, though they were closely watched by slave catchers. But in weather like this, no slave catcher would be out. The danger would be from the storm itself. They found a ravine cut deep into the hillside by centuries of water erosion. At the bottom was the entrance to a cave, not large but deep enough to provide real shelter. Jonah led Lila down the steep sides, half climbing and half sliding, using exposed roots as handholds. The entrance was partially blocked by fallen branches, but they managed to squeeze through into the darkness beyond. Inside, the sound of the storm became muted, reduced to a constant background roar. The air smelled of stone and earth and the faint musk of animal dens, but it was dry, or at least drier than outside, and it was protected. Jonah felt his legs give out, and he collapsed against the stone wall, pulling Lila down with him. They sat together in the darkness, clinging to each other, listening to the hurricane rage outside. For a long time, neither of them spoke. They were both too exhausted, too overwhelmed by everything that had happened. Jonah could feel Lila shaking against him, whether from cold or shock or relief he couldn't tell. Probably all three. He wrapped his arms around her, trying to share what little warmth his body still held, and felt her burrow against him. Finally, when his breathing had slowed and his heart had stopped trying to hammer its way out of his chest, he found his voice. He told her everything. About the 6 months at Beaumont, about the planning and the waiting, about the decision to run in the storm. He told her about the journey, about the miles of flooded swamp and forest, about the way the hurricane had seemed to move with him, opening paths and covering his trail. He told her about seeing Riverside collapsing, about the look on Jameson's face when he had to choose between revenge and survival. Lila listened without interrupting, her head resting on his shoulder, her breathing gradually evening out. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she started to tell her own story. The 6 months since his sail had been the worst of her life. The new overseer at Riverside, a man named Crenshaw, was even crueler than Garrett, and he had taken an immediate dislike to Lila, perhaps because she refused to be broken, perhaps because she reminded him of someone from his past. The bruise on her face was from 3 days ago, punishment for moving too slowly. There had been others on her arms and back, though those had faded. She had tried to keep hope alive, had tried to believe that Jonah would find a way back to her. But as weeks turned to months, doubt had started to creep in. Maybe he had tried to run and been caught. Maybe he had been sold further away. Maybe he had given up. But she had never stopped thinking about him, never stopped remembering their vows, never stopped praying that somehow they would be together again. Now here they were, hiding in a cave while a hurricane destroyed the world outside, and she didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Jonah held her tighter, feeling rage at what she had endured and relief that she had survived it. They talked about what would come next. They couldn't go back, that was clear. Going back meant death, or at least punishment so severe it might as well be death. They had to keep running, had to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the plantations before the storm passed and people started looking for them. But where could they go? North, obviously, but how far north? And how would they survive the journey? Lila had an idea. She had heard stories whispered among the women in the quarters about people who had escaped to the swamps and never came back. Not because they had been caught, but because they had found communities of runaways living in the deep bayous. Places so remote and difficult to reach that even slave catchers avoided them. Maroons, they were called. People who had created their own free settlements in the wilderness. It was dangerous and it was hard, but it was possible. If they could reach one of those communities, if they could prove themselves useful and trustworthy, they might find safety. At least for a while, at least until they could figure out the next step. Jonah considered this. He had heard similar stories but had always dismissed them as wishful thinking, tales told to give people hope when there was no real hope to be had. But now, faced with the immediate reality of their situation, it seemed like the best option. They couldn't survive alone in the wilderness indefinitely. They would need help, community, knowledge of how to live off the land. A maroon settlement, if they could find one, would provide all of that. The question was where to look. The stories were deliberately vague, locations kept secret to protect the people who lived there. But Lila had paid attention to details. She knew there was supposed to be a large settlement somewhere in the Atchafalaya Basin, deep in the maze of bayous and cypress swamps. It was perhaps 80 miles west of where they were now, a brutal journey even in good weather. But if they could reach it, they might find the freedom they both craved. They decided to wait out the storm in the cave and then start moving west as soon as it was safe. They had no supplies, no food, no tools beyond the chain still attached to Jonah's wrist, which he could potentially use as a weapon if needed. But they had each other, and they had determination, and right now that would have to be enough. As they made their plans, the storm outside continued to rage, but gradually, slowly, it began to weaken. The howling wind dropped to a roar, then to a steady blow. The rain, which had been falling like a wall of water, thinned to a heavy downpour. By late afternoon, though it was hard to tell time in the darkness of the cave, the worst had passed. The hurricane was moving on, carrying its destruction inland, leaving behind a landscape transformed by its passage. When they finally emerged from the cave, the world looked like something from a nightmare. Trees were down everywhere, their roots torn from the earth, their trunks snapped like kindling. The ravine they had climbed down was now running with water, a temporary creek that hadn't existed that morning. In the distance, through the rain that still fell steadily, they could see columns of smoke rising, buildings on fire despite the wet, set alight by lightning or lamps overturned in the chaos. The air smelled of torn vegetation and mud and the sharp ozone scent that followed lightning strikes. Everything was gray and brown and green, colors muted by rain and cloud. It looked like the end of the world. They climbed out of the ravine carefully, helping each other over the slick rocks and exposed roots. At the top, they paused to get their bearings. West. They needed to go west toward the setting sun, though the sun was hidden behind layers of cloud. Jonah used his knowledge of the land to orient them, remembering which way the rivers flowed, which direction the hills ran. They started walking, moving slowly through the destroyed forest, climbing over fallen trees, detouring around flooded areas, always heading west. The going was exhausting, and within an hour, both of them were stumbling with fatigue, but they pushed on. Every mile they put between themselves and Riverside was a mile toward safety. As evening approached, they came across a small creek that had swollen to a raging torrent. A massive log had fallen across it, creating a natural bridge, and they used it to cross, moving carefully on hands and knees while water churned beneath them. On the far side, they found the remains of a trapper's cabin, its roof gone, but its walls still partially standing. It wasn't much, but it was better than being exposed. They settled in the most sheltered corner, huddling together for warmth as darkness fell. Neither of them had eaten since the previous day, and hunger was starting to make itself known, but there was nothing to be done about it. They would search for food in the morning. For now they had shelter and they had each other. It was enough. The night was long and cold despite the warmth of the season. Being soaked to the bone for so many hours had leached the heat from their bodies, and they spent the dark hours shivering against each other, dozing fitfully but never really sleeping. When dawn came, gray and dim, they felt worse than they had the night before, stiff and sore and desperately thirsty. But they got moving again, driven by the knowledge that people would be looking for them. Jameson and his brothers, if they had survived the mansion's collapse, would not forget. Slave catchers would be hired. Dogs would be brought in once the ground dried enough for them to work. Every hour they rested was an hour their pursuers gained. They spent the next 3 days moving west through a landscape still reeling from the hurricane's passage. They saw no one, which was both a blessing and a worry. The isolation meant no immediate danger from slave catchers or angry overseers, but it also meant no opportunity to beg or steal food. They survived on what they could forage, cattail roots dug from the edges of ponds, berries that Lila recognized as safe, water drunk from relatively clear streams. It wasn't enough to satisfy their hunger, but it kept them moving. Jonah used the blacksmith's chain attached to his wrist to dig roots and as a tool for cracking open the occasional crayfish they found in shallow water. It was slow, hard work, but it kept them alive. On the 4th day, they reached the edge of the Atchafalaya Basin, and the landscape changed dramatically. The forest gave way to endless swamp, a maze of waterways and cypress groves and floating vegetation that stretched to the horizon. This was country that could swallow people whole, where solid ground was rare and the water was home to alligators and water moccasins and things that moved in the depths and were never seen. But it was also country where someone could disappear, where even determined pursuers would struggle to follow. If the maroon settlement existed, it would be somewhere in this trackless wilderness. They moved deeper into the swamp, traveling mostly by water, using fallen logs as rafts and pushing themselves along with improvised poles. The water was dark and still, reflecting the sky like a mirror, and every disturbance sent ripples spreading across its surface. Twice they saw alligators, massive prehistoric shapes that watched them with ancient eyes but didn't attack. Once they passed a cottonmouth coiled on a low branch, its white mouth open in warning, and they gave it a wide berth. Progress was slow and exhausting, and by the end of each day they were covered in insect bites and scratches from thorns and cypress knees. On the 7th day after leaving the cave, when they were beginning to wonder if the maroon settlement was just a myth after all, they found the first sign. It was a small marker, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. 3 stones stacked in a particular way on the edge of an island of higher ground. Lila spotted it first and pointed it out, her voice shaking with excitement and hope. It was a signal, she was sure, a marker used by runaways to indicate safe paths. They followed the direction it pointed, moving more carefully now, aware that they might be under observation. 2 hours later, they found the second marker, and then a third. They were being led deeper into the swamp, along paths that wound between cypress trees and through channels so narrow they had to squeeze through. Then, as the sun was beginning to set, they rounded a bend and found themselves facing 3 men in a canoe, all of them holding makeshift weapons, spears and clubs, and one ancient-looking musket. The men were African American, ranging in age from perhaps 20 to 50, all of them lean and hard from lives spent in the swamp. They looked at Jonah and Lila with expressions that mixed suspicion and curiosity. The oldest of the 3, a man with gray in his hair and a scar that ran from his forehead to his chin, spoke first. His voice was careful, measured, giving nothing away. Who were they? Where had they come from? How had they found this place? Jonah answered honestly, telling them about Beaumont and Riverside, about the escape during the hurricane, about their search for safety. The gray-haired man listened without expression, then conferred quietly with his companions. Finally, he turned back to Jonah and Lila and made a decision. They could come to the settlement, but they would be watched. Any sign of trouble, any indication that they had been followed or had betrayed the location, and they would be cast out. It was harsh, but it was fair. Jonah and Lila agreed immediately. The canoe led them through another hour of winding passages, deliberately taking a complex route that would be almost impossible to retrace. Finally, they emerged into a hidden lake surrounded by cypress and tupelo, and there, on a series of interconnected platforms and islands, was the maroon settlement. It was home to perhaps 40 people, men and women and children, all of them refugees from slavery, all of them living free in the heart of the swamp. The structures were simple, built from cypress logs and palmetto fronds, but they were solid and well-maintained. Gardens grew on the higher ground and racks of drying fish hung near several of the platforms. It wasn't paradise, but it was home, and it was free. Jonah and Lila were given a small platform at the edge of the settlement, barely large enough for the 2 of them, and told to rest. Food was brought, a simple stew of fish and wild vegetables, but it tasted like a feast after their days of near starvation. People came by in 2s and 3s, curious about the newcomers, asking questions, sharing their own stories. They learned that some of the people here had been free for years, while others had arrived just weeks before. They learned about the rules of the settlement, about how everyone contributed, about the watches that were kept to guard against discovery. They learned about the network of maroon settlements scattered through the swamps, connected by secret signals and occasional visits, a hidden nation of free people living in the spaces between the plantations. Over the following weeks, as summer gave way to fall, Jonah and Lila built a life in the settlement. Jonah used his strength to help with construction and heavy labor, expanding the platforms and building new structures. Lila, who had learned herbal medicine from her grandmother, became the settlement's healer, treating injuries and illnesses with plants gathered from the swamp. The chain was finally removed from Jonah's wrist by the settlement's blacksmith, a man named Isaac who had escaped from a foundry in Mobile and brought his skills with him. The scar remained, a permanent reminder of where they had come from. But the weight was gone. They built a small home together, just large enough for the two of them, with walls of woven palmetto and a roof that kept out the rain. They remarried properly this time, with the entire settlement as witnesses and a preacher who spoke words of blessing over them. It wasn't legal in the eyes of the law, but it was real in the eyes of God and the community, and that was all that mattered. They planted a small garden, learned to navigate the swamp's waterways, and slowly, gradually began to heal from the wounds that slavery had left on their bodies and spirits. Word reached them eventually of what had happened after the hurricane. The riverside mansion had been completely destroyed, with Jameson and both his brothers killed in the collapse. The elder Riverside had survived but was ruined, his plantation devastated, his workforce scattered. The overseer Crenshaw had been found dead in the wreckage of the quarters, crushed by a falling tree. It felt like justice, though Jonah took no pleasure in the deaths. Too many people had died in that storm, both free and enslaved. What mattered was that the threat from Riverside was gone. No one would be coming after them. Beaumont Plantation had fared better, with the big house damaged but standing. Richard Beaumont had posted rewards for Jonah's capture, but as months passed with no results, the effort faded. There were too many other problems, too many other concerns. The hurricane had reshaped the Gulf Coast, destroying plantations, killing thousands, changing the course of rivers. In the chaos that followed, 2 more runaways were barely noticed. The search eventually stopped, and Jonah and Lila were left in peace. Years passed in the settlement. Jonah and Lila had children, a daughter and then a son, both born free in the heart of the swamp. They raised their children with stories of courage and determination, teaching them about the hurricane that had brought their parents together, about the storm that had seemed to move with a man's desperate love for his wife. The children grew up knowing how to navigate the waterways, how to read the signs of approaching weather, how to live free in a world that said they should be slaves. They learned from the entire community, absorbing skills and knowledge that would serve them all their lives. The settlement grew and prospered as much as any hidden community could. New people arrived, refugees from the plantations, and were welcomed in. A few left, heading north to other states, carrying letters and messages to relatives left behind. The network of maroon settlements strengthened, creating a web of free communities that supported each other through trade and shared knowledge. It wasn't the freedom that Jonah had dreamed of as a young man, the freedom to walk openly in the world without fear. But it was real freedom nonetheless, the freedom to make their own choices, to live by their own rules, to build something that was theirs alone. Sometimes on quiet evenings when the work was done and the children were asleep, Jonah and Lila would sit together on their platform and watch the sun set over the swamp. They would talk about the hurricane, about that impossible journey through 40 miles of storm, about the mansion collapsing at the exact moment they needed it to, about the way the storm had seemed to know where they were going. Had it been coincidence, divine intervention, or something else? Something about the power of love and desperation that could bend even nature to its will. They never reached a conclusion, but they didn't need to. What mattered was that they were together, that they were free, that they had built a life against all odds. The story of Jonah's escape spread through the hidden communities, passed from one person to another in whispers and quiet conversations. It grew in the telling, acquiring details that may or may not have been true, becoming a legend that gave hope to people who had little of it. They said the storm had moved with him because he was righteous. They said the hurricane had been sent by God to punish the masters and free the enslaved. They said that when Jonah arrived at Riverside, battered and bleeding, the storm had attacked the big house like a living thing, tearing it apart with targeted fury. They said the moment he and Lila disappeared into the forest, the wind had died and the rain had stopped, as if the storm's purpose had been fulfilled. Some of these things were true or close to true, others were exaggerations, but the core of the story remained unchanged. A man had loved his wife enough to cross 40 miles of the worst hurricane the Gulf had ever seen. He had survived drowning and debris and exhaustion. He had found her, saved her, and carried her to freedom. And whether the storm had truly followed him or whether it had simply been the timing of the hurricane's path, the result was the same. Two people who should have died separately had lived together. Two people who should have remained enslaved had found freedom. And in the end, perhaps that was all the miracle anyone needed. Jonah lived to be an old man, his hair going gray and then white, his body marked by the scars of his journey but unbroken. Lila aged beside him, her smile still capable of lighting up the darkest day, her hands still gentle in healing. They saw their children grow and have children of their own, the third generation born free in the swamp. They saw the settlement survive hurricanes and droughts and the occasional close call with slave catchers. They saw the world slowly, painfully, begin to change, though not fast enough and not completely. And when people asked Jonah about that night, about the escape through the hurricane, about how he had survived what should have killed him, he always gave the same answer. He had made a promise to Lila, spoken under the stars on their wedding night, that he would always find her no matter what stood in his way. The hurricane had been in his way, so he had gone through it. The storm had been between them, so he had survived it. Love had given him strength, and determination had given him direction, and perhaps, just perhaps, something greater than both had opened the path. That was all he knew, and it was all he needed to know. He had kept his promise. Everything else was just details. The first winter in the settlement brought challenges that Jonah and Lila had not anticipated. While the swamp never froze, the cold months were harsh in their own way. The water temperature dropped until wading through it was painful. Food became scarce as fish retreated to deeper waters, and the damp chill seeped into bones and stayed there. Many of the settlement's residents fell ill with fevers and coughs, and Lila found herself working dawn to dusk, mixing remedies from bark and roots, trying to keep people alive through the worst of it. Jonah spent those months reinforcing structures against the wind, hunting in the uplands beyond the swamp, and learning from the older settlers how to read the subtle signs that indicated where animals might den or where edible plants still grew. It was during this first winter that they truly understood the price of freedom. Every meal had to be earned through effort and skill. Every piece of clothing had to be made or repaired by hand. Every illness had to be treated with whatever resources they could gather from the swamp itself. There were no stores to visit, no doctors to call, no authorities to appeal to when things went wrong. They were entirely dependent on themselves and each other, and the weight of that responsibility was heavy. But with the weight came something precious, the knowledge that what they built was theirs alone, that no master could take it away, that their children would inherit not chains, but the skills to survive and thrive in freedom. The settlement's council, made up of the 5 oldest residents, including the gray-haired man who had first found Jonah and Lila, met regularly to discuss threats and opportunities. Jonah was invited to join these meetings after 6 months, a sign that he had proven himself trustworthy and capable. The discussions were intense and sometimes heated, covering everything from whether to accept new refugees to how to respond to reports of slave catchers working the edges of the swamp. Jonah learned that the settlement had survived for nearly 12 years through a combination of careful planning, absolute secrecy, and a willingness to relocate entirely if the threat of discovery became too great. Every member understood that their survival depended on vigilance and that one careless mistake could doom them all. In the spring of their second year, a new family arrived at the settlement, and with them came troubling news. A man named Cyrus Blackwood had established himself as the most successful slave catcher in the region, and he specialized in hunting runaways in the swamps and bayous. Blackwood was methodical and patient, willing to spend weeks tracking a single person, and he had developed techniques for reading sign in the wetlands that made him exceptionally dangerous. He had already discovered and destroyed 2 smaller maroon settlements, dragging their inhabitants back to bondage or worse. The council debated whether to relocate immediately or to strengthen their defenses and hope Blackwood never found them. After days of discussion, they chose to stay, but with increased vigilance. Guards were posted at all approaches to the settlement, and everyone was trained in evacuation procedures in case discovery seemed imminent. Jonah volunteered for guard duty, spending long nights on watch at the edge of the settlement's territory, listening to the sounds of the swamp and trying to distinguish the normal noises from anything that might indicate human approach. It was during these watches that he truly learned the rhythms of the swamp, understanding how the gators moved at different times of night, recognizing the splash of fish versus the movement of larger animals, feeling the subtle shift in air pressure that preceded weather changes. He became one of the settlement's best scouts, able to move silently through water and vegetation, able to read the environment in ways that kept everyone safer. Lila, meanwhile, had become indispensable as a healer. Her knowledge of plants had grown exponentially as she explored the swamp, identifying species she had never seen before and learning their properties through careful experimentation and guidance from the settlement's elder women. She treated everything from cuts and broken bones to fevers and digestive ailments, and her success rate was high enough that people came to trust her completely. When a young mother went into difficult labor during a thunderstorm, it was Lila who saved both mother and child through hours of careful work. And after that night, her status in the community was unquestioned. She was not just a refugee anymore, but a pillar of the settlement, someone people relied on for survival. Their daughter, born in their 3rd year at the settlement, was named Ada after Lila's grandmother who had taught her about healing herbs. Ada came into the world on a clear morning when the cypress trees were reflected perfectly in the still water, and the air smelled of blooming water lilies. The entire settlement celebrated her birth, bringing gifts of food and handmade toys, offering blessings and promises of protection. For Jonah and Lila, holding their daughter and knowing she was born free was a moment of profound joy, mixed with equally profound responsibility. They would do whatever it took to keep her safe, to ensure she never knew chains, to give her the childhood they had been denied. As Ada grew from infant to toddler, she became the settlement's darling, learning to walk on the platforms before she could talk, fearless around water in a way that made her parents' hearts stop. The other children, ranging from babies to teenagers, embraced her as a younger sister, and she grew up in a web of community care that meant she was never alone, never without guidance or protection. Jonah watched her play and felt something in his chest expand and warm, a feeling he had never known before. This was what he had fought for, this laughter, this innocence, this freedom to simply be a child without fear. Their son, born 2 years after Ada, was named Gabriel, and he was quieter than his sister, more contemplative. Where Ada ran and shouted and explored, Gabriel watched and listened and absorbed. He showed an early talent for working with his hands, helping Isaac the blacksmith from the age of 5, learning to shape metal and wood into useful objects. Jonah recognized in his son a different kind of strength than his own, a patience and precision that would serve him well in life. Both children learned to read and write from an escaped schoolteacher named Mary, who had joined the settlement the year Ada was born, and they absorbed knowledge like dry ground absorbing rain. But peace in the settlement was always fragile, always temporary. In Gabriel's 4th year, which was 8 years after Jonah and Lila's arrival, Cyrus Blackwood finally found them. It happened in early fall when the water levels were low and travel through the swamp was easier than usual. One of the outer guards, a young man named Peter who had been at his post for less than a month, fell asleep during his watch. By the time he woke, Blackwood and 2 of his assistants were already within the settlement's perimeter, moving silently through the pre-dawn darkness, studying the layout, counting the platforms, planning their attack. It was Jonah, on his own patrol circuit, who discovered them. He had learned to trust his instincts in the swamp, and something about the night felt wrong. The birds too quiet, the insects too still. He moved more carefully than usual, checking shadows, watching the water for ripples that didn't belong. When he spotted the 3 men crouched behind a massive cypress, barely visible even to his trained eyes, his blood ran cold. He recognized Blackwood from descriptions others had given, a tall man with a weathered face and cold gray eyes that reflected no light. The slave catcher was studying the settlement through a brass spyglass, making notes in a small book, preparing for what would certainly be an attack at dawn when people would be just waking up, vulnerable and unprepared. Jonah didn't try to confront them alone. That would have been suicide and would have alerted them that they were discovered. Instead, he retreated silently, moving with all the skill he had developed over 8 years in the swamp, and raised the alarm. Within minutes, the settlement was awake and mobilizing. The evacuation plan they had practiced countless times went into effect with smooth efficiency. Children were gathered and taken to the emergency canoes hidden in the interior channels. Essential supplies were quickly packed. The oldest and youngest were evacuated first, while those who could fight stayed behind to delay any pursuit and to erase as many signs of the settlement as possible. The fight, when it came, was brief but brutal. Blackwood had not expected to be discovered, and when he and his assistants approached the settlement at first light, they found it defended rather than sleeping. Jonah was part of the group that met them, and in the chaos of the confrontation he came face to face with the slave catcher. For a moment their eyes met, and Jonah saw the recognition there, the understanding that this was not going to be an easy victory. Blackwood raised a pistol, but before he could fire, Isaac appeared from behind a cypress trunk and struck him across the shoulder with a length of iron pipe. The gun discharged into the water and Blackwood staggered. The slave catcher's assistants, seeing their leader injured and facing more resistance than expected, broke and ran. Blackwood himself, wounded but still dangerous, managed to retreat, crashing through the undergrowth and disappearing into the swamp. The settlement's defenders didn't pursue. Their goal wasn't to kill but to protect, and they had succeeded in that. But everyone knew what the fight meant. The settlement's location was compromised. Blackwood would return with more men, better armed and better prepared. They had no choice now but to relocate entirely, abandoning the home they had built over more than a decade. The evacuation took 2 days of exhausting work. Everything that could be carried was packed into canoes and rafts. Everything that couldn't be carried was either hidden or destroyed to prevent it from being used against them. The structures they had built were dismantled as much as possible. The gardens were trampled. The channels they had dug were filled with debris. By the time they were finished, The settlement looked like it had been abandoned years ago rather than days, and with luck that would slow any pursuit. The community, now numbering nearly 60 people, including children, moved deeper into the Atchafalaya Basin, following secret paths known only to the oldest scouts, heading for a location that had been scouted years earlier as a potential backup site. The journey to the new location took a week and tested everyone's endurance. Children cried from exhaustion and fear. Adults struggled with heavy loads and the constant worry that Blackwood might be following. They traveled mostly at night, hiding during the day, moving silently through water that sometimes reached their chests. Food was scarce, limited to what they had been able to carry and what could be caught on the move. Twice they had to detour around areas where they spotted signs of other people, unable to tell if they were slave catchers or just trappers, but unwilling to take the risk. Jonah carried Gabriel on his shoulders for miles at a stretch, while Lila led Ada by the hand, both parents exhausted but determined to see their children through this trial. The new settlement site was more remote than the old one, deeper in the swamp, harder to reach, more isolated. It required starting over from nothing, building new platforms, establishing new gardens, learning the patterns of new waterways. But the community came together with the same determination that had helped them survive before. Within weeks, basic shelter was established. Within months, the new settlement was functional. Within a year, it was beginning to feel like home, though everyone knew the old location would always hold a special place in their hearts. Jonah, now recognized as one of the settlement's leaders, was put in charge of security. He established a network of scouts that covered approaches from every direction, set up coded warning signals that could be passed quickly through the swamp, and personally trained every able-bodied adult in how to move silently, how to read sign, and how to fight if necessary. The encounter with Blackwood had taught them that vigilance alone wasn't enough. They needed to be prepared to defend themselves, to make attacking them so costly that even determined slave catchers would think twice. Lila expanded her healing work to include teaching, passing her knowledge to 3 apprentices who showed aptitude for the work. She had learned the hard way that relying on a single healer was dangerous. If something happened to her, the settlement needed others who could step in and continue the work. Her apprentices were eager students, and within a few years, all 3 were capable of handling most common ailments and injuries. This freed Lila to focus on the more complex cases and to spend more time with Ada and Gabriel, who were growing faster than seemed possible. Ada, at 10 years old, was already showing signs of the person she would become. She was bold and outspoken, unafraid to challenge authority when she thought something was wrong, fiercely protective of her younger brother and the other children in the settlement. She learned to handle a canoe before most children could write their names, could identify edible plants from poisonous ones at a glance, and showed a natural leadership that reminded Jonah of the best qualities of both her parents. Gabriel, at 8, was quieter but no less capable. He had become Isaac's official apprentice, spending hours at the forge learning to work metal, and he showed a talent for craftsmanship that was remarkable for his age. The years passed with a rhythm that felt almost normal. There were good years when food was plentiful and no threats emerged, and there were hard years when storms or drought or illness tested the community's resilience. There were births and deaths, marriages and separations, conflicts and reconciliations. The settlement grew as more refugees found their way to freedom, each with their own story of escape and survival, each adding their skills and knowledge to the collective strength. Jonah and Lila aged into their middle years, their bodies marked by hard work but their spirits unbroken, their love for each other deepening with every shared challenge and triumph. News from the outside world reached them occasionally through new arrivals or from the rare trader who could be trusted. They heard about the ongoing debates over slavery in the northern states, about the growing tensions between abolitionists and plantation owners, about underground networks helping refugees reach free territory. Some in the settlement dreamed of heading north, of finding true legal freedom rather than the fugitive freedom of the swamp. But others, including Jonah and Lila, had made their peace with their life in the basin. This was their home now, built with their own hands, governed by their own rules. It might not be perfect, but it was theirs. When Ada turned 16, she asked her father to tell her the full story of the hurricane escape, not the legend version that everyone knew, but the real story, the details that were too frightening or too painful for children. They sat together on the platform of their home, watching the sun set over the water, and Jonah told her everything. He described the fear and pain, the moments when he thought he wouldn't make it, the bodies he had seen floating in the flood, the sound of the riverside mansion collapsing. He told her about the choice he had faced to stay safe or to risk everything for love, and how that choice had shaped every decision he had made since. Ada listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she was quiet for a long time. Finally she spoke, her voice thoughtful. She said she understood now why he and her mother never took freedom for granted, why they worked so hard to protect the settlement, why they had taught her and Gabriel to be strong and self-reliant. She said she hoped she would have that kind of courage if she ever needed it, that kind of determination to fight for what mattered most. Jonah looked at his daughter, nearly grown now, and saw in her the future he and Lila had fought so hard to create. She would never know slavery, never know the feeling of chains, never know the helplessness of being someone else's property. She would make her own choices, live her own life, love whom she chose. That was worth everything he had endured, every scar on his body, every nightmare that still occasionally woke him in the dark. Freedom was not just a state of being, it was a legacy, something to pass down through generations, something to protect with the same fierce determination he had felt that night in the hurricane. Gabriel, too, came to understand his parents' story as he matured. He was quieter about it than Ada, processing in his own internal way. But Jonah saw the effects in how seriously his son took his responsibilities, in the care he put into his work, in the way he watched over the younger children in the settlement. Gabriel had inherited his mother's gentle nature and his father's determination, a combination that made him both kind and formidable. At 14, he was already a skilled blacksmith, creating tools and implements that were essential to the settlement's survival. He was also developing a reputation as someone who could mediate disputes, his calm presence and fair judgment making him a natural choice when conflicts arose. The settlement's leadership gradually shifted as the original founders aged, and a new generation stepped up. Jonah found himself in the role of elder statesman, someone consulted for wisdom and experience rather than day-to-day decisions. It was strange at first, stepping back from the constant vigilance that had defined his life for so many years, but it also brought a kind of peace. He and Lila had more time for each other, more time to simply sit and talk, more time to remember the journey that had brought them here and to appreciate the life they had built. They never saw Cyrus Blackwood again. Rumors reached them over the years that he had died in a swamp accident, or that he had retired after a failed raid left him injured, or that he had simply given up on the deep basin as too dangerous and unprofitable. Whatever the truth, the threat from him faded, though the settlement never stopped being vigilant. There were always slave catchers, always dangers, always reasons to stay alert and prepared. But the years of relative peace allowed the community to thrive in ways that would have been impossible during constant crisis. By the time Jonah reached his 50th year, the settlement had grown to over 100 people, making it one of the largest maroon communities in the region. It had its own governance structure, its own customs and traditions, its own identity distinct from both the world of slavery they had fled and the free world they could not safely join. Children born in the settlement knew only freedom, and some of them had never even seen the outside world, never encountered white people, never known anything but the community that had been built in the swamp. This was both a blessing and a concern. Jonah worried sometimes that the younger generation didn't fully appreciate the fragility of their freedom, didn't understand the constant threats that surrounded them. But he also recognized that their innocence was precisely what he and Lila had fought to preserve. When the nation fractured into civil war in 1861, the news reached the settlement through a refugee who had been working on a river dock when the first shots were fired. The community debated what this meant for them, whether it represented opportunity or danger. Some argued they should make contact with Union forces if and when they came to Louisiana, offering to help in exchange for protection and recognition. Others insisted that staying hidden was still the safest course, that wars ended and governments changed, but the swamp remained constant. The debate was never fully resolved, as Union control of Louisiana proved incomplete and contested throughout the conflict. But the fact that they could even have such a debate, that they could discuss their own future as free people making choices, was itself a testament to what they had achieved. Jonah lived to see the war's end and the formal abolition of slavery, though the news came to them months late and filtered through layers of uncertainty. When a former slave who had joined the Union Army made his way to the settlement and confirmed that slavery had been legally ended throughout the nation, there was celebration, but also confusion. What did this mean for them? Were they still fugitives, or were they now citizens? Could they leave the swamp if they wanted, or would they be punished for the years they had spent in hiding? The questions were complex and the answers unclear, but one thing was certain. They had survived, against all odds, through storms and slave catchers and disease and hardship. They had survived and preserved their freedom. Lila, at 62, was still working as a healer, though her apprentices now handled most of the routine cases. Her hair had gone white, and her hands sometimes trembled with age, but her mind was sharp, and her knowledge was encyclopedic. She had delivered over 40 babies during her years in the settlement, had saved countless lives through her treatments, had trained a generation of healers who would carry her knowledge forward. When people thanked her for her work, she always said the same thing. She was just grateful to be able to help, grateful to use her skills for people who were free rather than enslaved. The ability to choose how to use her talents, rather than having them exploited by a master, was a gift she never took for granted. Ada and Gabriel both married within the settlement. Ada to a young man named Josiah, who had arrived as a teenager and proven himself as a skilled hunter and scout. Gabriel to a quiet woman named Sarah, who shared his talent for craftsmanship and his gentle nature. Jonah and Lila became grandparents multiple times over, and they took fierce joy in the squirming babies and rambunctious toddlers who represented the third generation born free in the swamp. These children would grow up in a changed world, one where slavery was officially illegal, though everyone knew that the reality would be more complicated than the law suggested. But they would have opportunities, choices, possibilities that their grandparents could never have imagined. The story ended the way all good stories do, not with a grand finale, but with the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived. Jonah and Lila grew old together in freedom, surrounded by the family they had built and the community that had given them shelter. When Lila finally passed in her 71st year, weakened by a winter fever that her own remedies could not cure, Jonah held her hand as she slipped away. Their fingers intertwined as they had been that night in the hurricane when they first reunited. Her last words were about how grateful she was for every day they had shared, every moment of freedom, every choice they had been able to make together. She died smiling, surrounded by children and grandchildren, in a home she had built with her own hands. Jonah lived another 4 years, quieter without Lila but sustained by his family and his memories. He spent his final years telling stories to the youngest generation, making sure they understood the price of freedom and the responsibility that came with it. He told them about the hurricane, about the storm that had seemed to follow him, about the moment when he had to choose between safety and love. He told them about Lila, about her strength and kindness, about the life they had built together against all odds. And he told them that freedom was not just the absence of chains, but the presence of choice, the ability to determine your own path and to fight for what mattered most. When Jonah finally passed peacefully in his sleep at 75, the settlement mourned him but celebrated his memory. He was buried beside Lila on a small island in the heart of the swamp, their graves marked by simple cypress boards carved with their names and the dates of their lives. The settlement continued on, adapting to the changing world outside, some members eventually leaving to try their luck in the cities now that slavery was officially ended, others staying in the swamp where they had found safety and community. But all of them carried the story of Jonah and Lila forward, telling their children and their children's children about love that could not be broken and determination that could not be denied. And sometimes, on nights when big storms rolled in from the Gulf, when the wind howled and the rain fell in sheets and the swamp trembled with the force of nature's fury, the old folks in the settlement would nod knowingly. They would gather the children close and tell them about Jonah and Lila, about love that could not be broken and determination that could not be denied. They would say that as long as there were people who fought for freedom, as long as there were lovers who refused to be separated, the spirit of that hurricane night would live on. The storm had followed Jonah Wells because his cause was just, because his love was true, because some things were worth fighting for no matter the cost. And if you listened carefully on those stormy nights when the wind screamed and the water rose, you could almost hear Jonah's voice calling for Lila, and Lila's voice answering back, two souls united across all barriers, together forever in the freedom they had earned.